afternoon, everyone. So, why would a woman who works with women, I counsel women, who has the word woman in her organization not once, but twice, who has experienced domestic abuse, care so deeply about the state of our men? Well, for me, it's personal. And it stems from 3 inspirational men. And the first is my beloved, maternal, dearly departed grandfather, Morris Latham Jr. We called him Big Daddy. And the second is my father, William Wallace Payne. And the third is Nelson Mandela. So my grandfather was a storyteller. And my grandfather, when he told his stories, was like the best place for me to be. I was enthralled. It's no wonder I became a writer, because sitting with him was just a magnificent experience. And I was in awe of my grandfather. My grandfather, who grew up in the segregated South, segregated Mississippi at that, never, ever blamed white people. You never heard the phrase, well, the white man. You never heard, well, white people. I did not grow up with that language. And for me, that was extraordinary, given one story Big Daddy would tell again and again. It was the story of his father, Benjamin, my great-grandfather. Now, Benjamin was a merchant, and Benjamin would go to the supply truck when it came to his small little town in Mississippi to get supplies for his store like everybody else. Until one day, a white man stopped my great-grandfather, and he said, "Boy, don't you come here. Don't you know you're not supposed to be here? You don't come here when we're here. Don't you come here no more. You wait until we're finished, then you come here." So what does my great-grandfather do? When the supply truck came again, so did my great-grandfather. And he came again and again and again, until one time. And this is how my Big Daddy tells it. He said, "Stephanie, when my father got up to leave, they shot him in the back. Stephanie, they shot my father dead. I had so much anger in me, I thought it was gonna burst. I knew I had to get that anger out of me, but I didn't know how to do it. And then one day, I figured it out. I said to myself, I'm gonna get me a shotgun and I'm gonna kill that man who killed my father." So Big Daddy got that shotgun. And Big Daddy found that man. And this is what he told me. He said, "Stephanie, that man was living in an old shack. Stephanie, that man didn't have any teeth in his mouth. That man was living far worse than I had ever lived. That man was already being punished." And for me, that shaped who I am today. Because Big Daddy understood it wasn't a white man who killed his father. It was an ill-thought-out, fear-based cultural structure called Jim Crow. Now, Jim Crow said, you don't get to ask who you like. You don't get to be with who you love. Jim Crow said, I tell you who to have compassion for. Jim Crow said, when somebody breaks our rules, we tell you what to do. And that brings me to my father, who also was born and raised in the segregated South. Now, my father is an unlikely inspiration in my life because I did not know him. And what I did know of him, I did not like. My father was a mean, red-eyed drunk. And when I was a little girl, and my father would come around, I would go sick in my stomach. And when my father would start screaming at my mother, I couldn't stand to be in my body. I would float out of my body and watch from the ceiling where it was safe. So when I was about 9 or 10, we escaped my father. And I mean escaped. So what did I do? I put my father in a nice, neat, tight little box of indifference. And I went about living my life. So it's 2010 now. I'm married. I have 3 beautiful children. I became that writer Big Daddy inspired me to be. I had been contacted by an agent. I was working on my first novel. But I could not write that book. I truly believe that writing is a spiritual act, that the stories that tumble forth from us are the stories our soul needs to tell. My soul needed to tell another story. My soul needed to tell the story of my father. So I set out looking for him. And I landed in Indianapolis, Indiana, 3 weeks almost to the day that my father had passed away. But I got to know my father. I got to know my father through his best friend, Mr. Mac Davis. Now, it was just some kind of synchronicity that I thought to knock on the door of the old address that I had for my father. And when Mr. Mac Davis opened that door and I told him who I was, he said, "Oh my goodness, Billy would be so happy to see you." Oh, he loved his 3 girls. He talked about you guys all the time. He talked about his heyday in LA. I got to know my father through the property manager who told me that he had abandoned his apartment when he wandered into the emergency room with Alzheimer's and pneumonia. She said, "Your father was a gentleman, and your father had a hard life. You know, your father was homeless for a while." I got to know my father through the police officer who came to my hotel, who came to the Marriott and sat with me in the lobby, and I'll never forget this, after I filled out a missing persons report and told him about my alcoholic father and da-da-da. He looked at me and he said, "Your father was not drinking while he was in Indianapolis. If he had been drinking, he would be on our grid, and your father was not on our grid. I hope that gives you some peace." And it did. But how I really came to know my father was through a registered letter that I received from his youngest sister after I reconnected with the family. And in this letter, she told me that my father, the oldest of 7 children, used to take care of them and was really kind to them. She said, "I used to think William's kids are going to have it made because he's such a pushover." She told me she was surprised by the switch that he made, and she offered me this. She said my father had 3 friends. She said when you saw one, you saw the other. I learned that my father began drinking very early. By the time my father was in high school, he was a full-blown alcoholic. So my father and these 3 friends would drink every weekend, except for one weekend. Now, my father's mother and his siblings went to California after their father had died. My father stayed behind with his grandparents. One weekend, he was called out west, and while my father was on a plane flying out west, those 3 friends, drunk, in an old pickup truck, trying to beat a train across some railroad tracks, lost their lives. She told me my father never got over that. And what that told me is that my father, who was under the same ill-thought-out, fear-based cultural system of Jim Crow, was under another ill thought out, fear-based system, patriarchy. I realized that as my grandfather had a hard time releasing his anger, my father, within the strictures of patriarchy, could not release his sorrow. And that brings me to Nelson Mandela. Now, Nelson Mandela, with two tenets, healed an entire nation by giving voice to those who were victims of crimes under apartheid and giving amnesty to those who perpetrated crimes under apartheid. Nelson Mandela said when he left prison, "As I walked out the door toward the gate that would lead to my freedom, I knew if I didn't leave behind the hatred and the bitterness, I'd still be in prison." I was in prison. My neat little box of indifference was spilling over with hatred and bitterness towards myself. I found myself in relationship after relationship with men who did not serve me. I found myself tapping down my dreams. So I made some changes and began to heal. I started to write that story that my soul wanted to tell. I left a marriage that no longer served me and dishonored me. And I began working with women. And a funny thing happened when I started working with women. I became sensitized to the needs of men. As I was inviting women to go through the process of healing that I went through, it became apparent to me that men do not have the space within our culture to do the same. So I conducted this very unscientific study at the college where I teach. So I had 4 panels put up in a high traffic area for 5 days, and we beckoned students to come out and answer 4 questions. What's good about being a woman? What's not so good about being a woman? What's good about being a man? What's not so good about being a man? And the data that I collected was not surprising. It just affirmed to me that women feel undervalued and men feel under pressure. But what was surprising to me was who participated. And the men participated almost 2 to 1. And what that told me was that men are yearning for a platform to express themselves, to show their feelings. And I understood that we have to address patriarchy. I think about what Nelson Mandela's Truth and Reconciliation Commission said about apartheid. It said, no section of society escaped its abuses. No section of our society escapes the abuses of patriarchy. So yes, we have to address women who have experienced domestic abuse and domestic violence. And I make the distinction between the two because in interviewing my mother and learning my story, it was the verbal abuse that was far more harmful to her than the physical abuse. We have to address the women who have been raped, but that is just half of our work. We must take care of our men. If we don't, the cycle will repeat and repeat and repeat. I'm reminded of what Jungian analyst and scholar and writer Marion Woodman said. Patriarchy has done as profound damage to men as it has to women. So I invite each and every one of you today to examine your box of indifference and join me in dismantling a system that has hurt us all. And we can do it. We've done it before. We dismantled Jim Crow. We have the lovely 2 tenets of Nelson Mandela. But if we are to walk toward that path, toward the gate that will lead to our freedom as men and women, we must address the ill-thought-out, fear-based structure of patriarchy. Thank you.